Empire by Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri. Part 2. Passages of Sovereignty. Section 2.1. Two Europes, Two Modernities. Quote, whether you affirm infallibility and deduce sovereignty from it, or pose sovereignty first and derive infallibility from that, you are forced either way to recognize and sanction an absolute power. And the same result is imposed, whether it be through oppression of governments or the reason of philosophers, whether you make the people or the king sovereign. End quote, by François Guizot. In the early 20th century, Vienna of Robert Musil's novel The Man Without Qualities, an enlightened aristocrat, Count Leinsdorf, puzzles out the complexities of modernity but gets stuck on a central paradox. What I still don't understand, he says, is this: that people should love each other and that it takes a firm hand in government to make them do it is nothing new. So why should it suddenly be a case of either or? For the philanthropist of Musil's world, there is a conflict at the center of modernity between, on the one hand, the immanent forces of desire and association, the love of the community, and on the other, the strong hand of an overarching authority that imposes and enforces an order on the social field. This tension was to be resolved, or at least mediated, by the sovereignty of the state, and yet it continually resurfaces as a question of either or, freedom or servitude, the liberation of desire or its subjugation. Count Leinsdorf lucidly identifies a contradiction that runs throughout European modernity and resides at the heart of the modern concept of sovereignty. Tracing the emerging figure of the concept of sovereignty through various developments in modern European philosophy should allow us to recognize that Europe and modernity are neither unitary nor pacific constructions, but rather, from the beginning, were characterized by struggle, conflict, and crisis. We identify three moments in the constitution of European modernity that articulate the initial figure of the modern concept of sovereignty. First, the revolutionary discovery of the plane of immanence. Second, the reaction against these immanent forces and the crisis in the form of authority. And third, the partial and temporary resolution of this crisis in the formation of the modern state as a locus of sovereignty that transcends and mediates the plane of immanent forces. In this progression, European modernity itself becomes increasingly inseparable from the principle of sovereignty. And yet, as Count Leinsdorf laments, even at the height of modernity, the original tension continually breaks through in all its violence. Modern sovereignty is a European concept in the sense that it developed primarily in Europe in coordination with the evolution of modernity itself. The concept functions as a cornerstone of the construction of Eurocentrism. Although modern sovereignty emanated from Europe, however, it was born and developed in large part through Europe's relationship with its outside, and particularly through its colonial project and the resistance to the colonized. Modern sovereignty emerged then as a concept of European reaction and European domination both within and outside its borders. They are two coextensive and complementary faces of one development: rule within Europe and European rule over the world. The revolutionary plane of immanence. It all began with a revolution in Europe between 1200 and 1600, across distances that only merchants and armies could travel, and only the invention of the printing press would later bring together. Something extraordinary happened. Humans declared themselves masters of their own lives, producers of cities and history, and inventors of heavens. They inherited a dualistic consciousness, a hierarchical vision of society, and a metaphysical idea of science. But they handed down to future generations an experimental idea of science, a constituent conception of history and cities, and they posed beings in immanent terrain of knowledge and action. The thought of this initial period, born simultaneously in politics, science, art, philosophy, and theology, demonstrates the radicality of the forces at work in modernity. The origins of European modernity are often characterized as springing from a secularizing process that denied divine and transcendent authority over worldly affairs. That process was certainly important, but in our view, it was really only a symptom of the primary event of modernity, the affirmation of the powers of this world, the discovery of the plane of immanence. Omni ons habet aliquad esse proprium. Every entity has a singular essence. Duns Scotus affirmation subverts the medieval conception of being as an object of analogical and thus dualistic predication. a being with one foot in this world and one in the transcendent realm. We are at the beginning of the 14th century, in the midst of the convulsions of the late Middle Ages. Duns Scotus tells his contemporaries that the confusion and decadence of the times can be remedied only by recentering thought on the singularity of being. This singularity is not ephemeral nor accidental, but ontological. The strength of this affirmation and the effect it had on the thought of the period were demonstrated by Dante Alighieri's response to it, thousands of miles away from Duns Scotus's Britannic North. This singular being is powerful, Dante wrote, in that it is a drive to actualize totum potentium intellectus possibilis, all the power of the possible intellect. At the scene of the birth of European modernity, humanity discovered its power in the world and integrated this dignity into a new consciousness of reason and potentiality. In the 15th century, numerous authors demonstrated the coherence and revolutionary originality of this new, immanent ontological knowledge. Let us simply cite three representative voices. First, Nicholas of Cusa, quote, "Speculation is a movement of the intellect from quia a to quid a, and since quid a is infinitely distant from quia a, such a movement will never come to an end. And it is a very pleasurable movement, since it is the life itself of the intellect. From this fact, such movement finds its satisfaction, since its motion does not generate fatigue, but rather light and heat." End quote. Second, Pico della Mirandola, quote, "When you conceive of God as a living and knowing being, make sure before all else that this knowledge and this life are understood as free from every imperfection. Conceive of a knowledge that knows all and everything in a most perfect manner, and add still that the knower knows all by itself, so there is no need to search outside itself, which would make it imperfect." End quote. In this way, Pico della Mirandola, rather than conceiving a distant transcendent God, makes the human mind into a divine machine of knowledge. Finally, Bovilla's, quote, "The one who was by nature merely human, homo, becomes, through the rich contribution of art, doubly human, that is, homo homo." End quote. Through its own powerful arts and practices, humanity enriches and doubles itself, or really raises itself to a higher power, homo homo, humanity squared. In those origins of modernity, then, knowledge shifted from the transcendent plane to the immanent, and consequently, that human knowledge became a doing, a practice of transforming nature. Sir Francis Bacon constructed a world in which, quote, "What has been discovered in the arts and the sciences can now be reorganized through usage, meditation, observation, argumentation, because it is good to treat the most distant realities and the occult secrets of nature through the introduction of a better use and a more perfect technique of the mind and the intellect." End quote. In this process, Galileo Galilei maintains, and this will conclude our circle, De Dignitate Hominis, we have the possibility of equaling divine knowledge. Quote, "Taking the understanding to be intensive, insofar as that term carries with it intensively, that is perfectly, several propositions, I say that human intellect understands some things so perfectly, and it has such absolute certainty of them, that it equals nature's own understanding of them. Those things include the pure mathematical sciences, that is, geometry and arithmetic, about which the divine intellect knows infinitely more propositions, since it knows them all. But of those few understood by the human intellect, I believe that its knowledge equals divine knowledge in its objective certainty." End quote. What is revolutionary in this whole series of philosophical developments stretching from the 13th to the 16th centuries is that the powers of creation that had previously been consigned exclusively to the heavens are now brought down to earth. This is the discovery of the fullness of the plane of immanence. Just as in philosophy and science, in politics too, humanity reappropriated in this early period of modernity what medieval transcendence had taken away from it. In the span of 3 or 4 centuries, the process of the refoundation of authority on the basis of a human universal and through the action of a multitude of singularities was accomplished with great force, amid dreadful tragedies and heroic conquests. William of Ockham, for example, claimed that the church is the multitude of the faithful, meaning that it is not superior to and distinct from the community of Christians, but immanent to that community. Marsilius of Padua posed the same definition for the Republic. The power of the Republic and the power of its laws derive not from superior principles, but from the assembly of citizens. A new understanding of power and a new conception of liberation were set in motion. From Dante in the late medieval Apologia of the Possible Intellect to Thomas More in the celebration of the immense and inexplicable power of natural life and labor as foundation for the political arrangement. From the democracy of the Protestant sects to Spinoza and his notion of the absoluteness of the democracy. By the time we arrive at Spinoza, in fact, the horizon of immanence and the horizon of the democratic political order coincide completely. The plane of immanence is the one on which the powers of singularity are realized, and the one on which the truth of the new humanity is determined historically, technically, and politically. For this very fact, because there cannot be any external mediation, the singular is presented as the multitude. Modernity's beginnings were revolutionary, and the old order was toppled by them. The constitution of modernity was not about theory in isolation, but about theoretical acts indissolubly tied to mutations of practice and reality. Bodies and brains were fundamentally transformed. This historical process of subjectification was revolutionary in the sense that it determined a paradigmic and irreversible change in the mode of life of the multitude. Modernity as crisis. Modernity is not a unitary concept, but rather appears in at least two modes. The first mode is the one we have already defined, a radical revolutionary process. This modernity destroys the relations with the past and declares the immanence of the new paradigm of the world and life. It develops knowledge and action as scientific experimentation and defines a tendency toward a democratic politics, posing humanity and desire at the center of history. From the artisan to the astronomer, from the merchant to the politician, in art as in religion, the material of existence is reformed by a new life. This new emergence, however, created a war. How could such a radical overturning not incite strong antagonism? How could this revolution not determine a counter-revolution? There was indeed a counter-revolution in the proper sense of the term, a cultural, philosophical, social, and political initiative that, since it could neither return to the past nor destroy the new forces, sought to dominate and expropriate the force of the emerging movements and dynamics. This is the second mode of modernity, constructed to wage war against the new forces and establish an overarching power to dominate them. It arose within the Renaissance Revolution to divert its direction, transplant the new image of humanity to a transcendent plane, relativize the capacities of science to transform the world, and above all, oppose the reappropriation of power on the part of the multitude. The second mode of modernity poses a transcendent constituted power against an immanent constituent power, order against desire. The Renaissance thus ended in war, religious, social, and civil war. The European Renaissance, but above all the Italian Renaissance, with the splendid and perverse works that characterized it, was the site of the civil war over the realization of modernity. When the Reformation spread throughout Europe, it was like a second cyclone added to the first, repeating in the religious consciousness of the masses the alternatives of humanist culture. The Civil War thus invested popular life and mingled with the most intimate recesses of human history. Class struggle moved across the terrain, marshalling up in the genesis of capitalism, the creativity of the new mode of laboring, and the new order of exploitation within a logic that carries together signs of both progress and reaction. It was a clash of titans, like the one Michelangelo depicted in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the tragic conflict of the genesis of modernity. The revolution of European modernity ran into its thermidor. In the struggle for hegemony over the paradigm of modernity, victory went to the second mode in the forces of order that sought to neutralize the power of the revolution. Although it was not possible to go back to the way things were, it was, nonetheless, possible to reestablish ideologies of command and authority, and thus deploy a new transcendent power by playing on the anxiety and fear of the masses, their desire to reduce the uncertainty of life and increase security. The revolution had to be stopped. Throughout the 16th century, whenever the fruits of the revolution appeared in all their splendor, the scene had to be painted in twilight colors. The demand for peace became paramount. But what peace? While the 30 Years' War in the heart of Europe exemplified in the most terrible forms the outlines of this irreversible crisis, the consciousness, even the strongest and wisest, yielded to the necessity of the thermidor and the conditions of the miserable and humiliating peace. Peace was a value that in a short stretch of time had lost the humanist, Erasmian connotations that had previously made it the path of transformation. Peace had become the miserable condition of survival, the extreme urgency of escaping death. Peace was marked simply by the fatigue of the struggle and the usury of the passions. The Thermidor had won. The revolution was over. The Thermidor of the revolution, however, did not close, but only perpetuated the crisis. Civil war did not come to an end, but was absorbed within the concept of modernity. Modernity itself is defined by crisis, a crisis that is born of the uninterrupted conflict between the immanent, constructive, creative forces and the transcendent power aimed at restoring order. This conflict is the key to the concept of modernity, but it was effectively dominated and held in check. The cultural and religious revolutions were forced toward rigid and sometimes ferocious structures of containment. In the 17th century, Europe became feudal again. The counter-reformist Catholic Church was the first and most effective example of this reaction, because that church itself earlier had been rocked by an earthquake of reform and revolutionary desire. The Protestant churches and political orders were not far behind in producing the order of the counter-revolution. Throughout Europe, the fires of superstition were lit, and yet the movements of renewal continued their work of liberation at the base. Wherever spaces were closed, movements turned to nomadism and exodus, carrying with them the desire and hope of an irrepressible experience. The internal conflict over European modernity was also reflected simultaneously on a global scale as an external conflict. The development of Renaissance thought coincided both with the European discovery of the Americas and with the beginnings of European dominance of the rest of the world. Europe had discovered its outside. If the period of the Renaissance marks a qualitative break in the history of humanity, writes Samir Amin, it is precisely because, from that time on, Europeans become conscious of the idea that the conquest of the world by their civilization is henceforth a possible objective. From this moment on, and not before, Eurocentrism crystallizes. On the one hand, Renaissance humanism initiated a revolutionary notion of human equality, of singularity and community, cooperation and multitude, that resonated with forces and desires extending horizontally across the globe, redoubled by the discovery of other populations and territories. On the other hand, however, the same counter-revolutionary power that sought to control the constituent and subversive forces within Europe also began to realize the possibility and necessity of subordinating other populations to European domination. Eurocentrism was born as a reaction to the potentiality of a newfound human equality. It was a counter-revolution on a global scale. Here, too, the second mode of modernity gained the upper hand, but again, not in a definitive way. European modernity is from its beginnings a war on two fronts. European mastery is always in crisis, and this is the very same crisis that defines European modernity. In the 17th century, the concept of modernity as crisis was definitively consolidated. The century began with the burning of Giordano Bruno at the stake, and it went on to see monstrous civil wars break out in France and England. And above all, it witnessed a horrible spectacle of the 30 years of German Civil War. At the same time, the European conquest of the Americas and the slaughter and enslavement of its native populations proceeded with ever-increasing intensity. In the second half of the century, monarchic absolutism seemed definitively to block the course of freedom in the countries of continental Europe. Absolutism sought to fix the concept of modernity and strip it of the crisis that defines it through the deployment of a new armory of transcendentals. At the same time, outside of Europe, conquest slowly gave way to colonialism, and the precarious search for gold, riches, and plunder was progressively displaced by trade exclusives, stable forms of production, and the African slave trade. The 17th century, however, and this is what makes it so ambiguous, was a fragile Baroque century. From the abysses of the social world always arose a memory of what it had tried to bury. We can find testimony to this fact with one single but enormous reference: Spinoza's philosophy of immanence, which dominated the latter half of the century of European thought. It is a philosophy that renewed the splendors of revolutionary humanism, putting humanity and nature in the position of God, transforming the world into a territory of practice, and affirming the democracy of the multitude as the absolute form of politics. Spinoza carried the idea of death, that death that states and powers carried like a weapon against a desire and hope of liberation, merely a hostage used to blackmail the freedom of thought, and thus banned it from his philosophy. A free man thinks about nothing less than of death, and his knowledge is a meditation on life, not on death. That love that the humanist considered the supreme form of the expression of intelligence was posed by Spinoza as the only possible foundation of the liberation of singularities and as the ethical cement of collective life. There is nothing in nature which is contrary to this intellectual love, or which can take it away. In this crescendo of thought, Spinoza testified to the uninterrupted continuity of the revolutionary program of humanism in the course of the 17th century. The Transcendental apparatus. The counter-revolutionary project to resolve the crisis of modernity unfolded in the centuries of the Enlightenment. The primary task of this Enlightenment was to dominate the idea of immanence without reproducing the absolute dualism of medieval culture by constructing a transcendental apparatus capable of disciplining a multitude of formerly free subjects. The ontological dualism of the culture of the ancient regime had to be replaced by a functional dualism, and the crisis of modernity had to be resolved by means of adequate mechanisms of mediation. It was paramount to avoid the multitudes being understood, a la Spinoza, in a direct, immediate relation with divinity and nature, as the ethical producer of life in the world. On the contrary, in every case, mediation had to be imposed in the complexity of human relations. Philosophers disputed whether this mediation was situated and what metaphysical level it occupied, but it was fundamental that, in some way, it be defined as an ineluctable condition of all human action, art, and association. Hence, the triad of strength, desire, and love, which constituted the productive matrix of the revolutionary thought of humanism, was opposed by a triad of specific mediations. Nature and experience are unrecognizable except through the filter of phenomena. Human knowledge cannot be achieved except through the reflection of the intellect, and the ethical world is incommunicable except through the schematism of reason. What is at play is a form of mediation, or really a reflexive folding back and a sort of weak transcendence, which relativizes experience and abolishes every instance of the immediate and absolute in human life and history. Why, however, is this relativity necessary? Why cannot knowledge and will be allowed to claim themselves to be absolute? Because every movement of self-constitution of the multitude must yield to a pre-constituted order, and because claiming that humans could immediately establish their freedom and being would be a subversive delirium. This is the essential core of the ideological passage in which the hegemonic concept of European modernity was constructed. The first strategic masterpiece of this construction was accomplished by René Descartes. Although Descartes pretended to pursue a new humanistic project of knowledge, he really re-established transcendent order. When he posed reason as the exclusive terrain of mediation between God and the world, he effectively reaffirmed dualism as a defining feature of experience and thought. We should be careful here. Mediation in Descartes is never well defined, or really, if we stay close to the text, we find that mediation resides mysteriously only in the will of God. Descartes' cunning stratagem consists primarily in this. When he addresses the centrality of thought and the transcendental function of mediation, he defines a sort of residual of divine transcendence. Descartes claims that the logics of mediation reside in thought, and that God is very far from the scene. But a new man, such as Blaise Pascal, is perfectly right to object that this is just an example of Descartes' trickery. In fact, Descartes' God is very close. God is a guarantee that transcendental rule is inscribed in consciousness and thought is necessary, universal, and thus pre-constituted. Quote, "Please do not hesitate to assert and proclaim everywhere that it is God who has laid down these laws in nature, just as a king lays down laws in his kingdom. There is no single one that we cannot understand if our minds turn to consider it. They are all inborn in our minds, just as a king would imprint his laws on the hearts of all his subjects if he had enough power to do so. The greatness of God, on the other hand, is something which we cannot comprehend even though we know it, but the very fact that we judge it incomprehensible makes us esteem it the more greatly. Just as a king has more majesty when he is less familiarly known by his subjects, provided, of course, they do not get the idea that they have no king. They must know him enough to be in no doubt about that." End quote. The realm of potentiality, which had been opened by the humanist principle of subjectivity, is limited a priori by the imposition of transcendent rule and order. Descartes surreptitiously reproposes theology on the terrain that humanism had cleared, and its apparatus is resolutely transcendental. With Descartes, we are at the beginning of the history of the Enlightenment, or rather bourgeois ideology. The transcendental apparatus he proposes is a distinctive trademark of European Enlightenment thought. In both the empiricist and the idealist currents, transcendentalism was the exclusive horizon of ideology, and in the successive centuries, nearly all the major currents of philosophy would be drawn into this project. The symbiosis between intellectual labor and institutional, political, and scientific rhetorics became absolute on this terrain, and every conceptual formation came to be marked by it. The formalization of politics, the instrumentalization of science and technique for profit, the pacification of social antagonisms. Certainly, in each of these fields, we find historically specific developments, but everything was always tied up with a line of a grand narrative that European modernity told about itself, a tale told in a transcendental dialect. In many respects, the works of Immanuel Kant stands at the center of this development. Kant's thought is enormously rich and leads in numerous directions, but we are interested here primarily in the line that crowns the transcendental principle as the apex of European modernity. Kant manages to pose a subject at the center of the metaphysical horizon, but at the same time, control it by means of the three operations we cited earlier: the emptying of experience and phenomena, the reduction of knowledge to intellectual mediation, and the neutralization of ethical action in the schematism of reason. The mediation that Descartes invoked in his reaffirmation of dualism is hypostatized by Kant, not in the divinity, but nonetheless in a pseudo-ontological critique, in an ordering function of consciousness and an indistinct appetite of the will. Humanity is the center of the universe, but this is not the humanity that through art and action made itself homo. It is a humanity lost in experience, diluted in the pursuit of the ethical ideal. Kant throws us back into the crisis of modernity with full awareness when he poses to discover the subject itself as crisis. But this crisis is made into an apology of the transcendental as a unique and exclusive horizon of knowledge and action. The world becomes an architecture of ideal forms, the only reality conceded to us. Romanticism was never expressed so strongly as it is in Kant. This is the leitmotif of Kantian philosophy, the necessity of the transcendental, the impossibility of every form of immediacy, the exorcism of every vital figure in the apprehension and action of being. From this perspective, one should perhaps consider Arthur Schopenhauer the most lucid reader of Kantianism and his romantic gesture. The fact that it is difficult, if not impossible, to reunite the appearance of the thing with the thing itself is precisely the curse of this world of pain and need, and this is therefore not a world constructed in a way so that noble and high forces that tend to truth and light, can prosper. In other words, Schopenhauer recognizes Kantianism as a definitive liquidation of the humanist revolution. For this same reason, Schopenhauer reacted even more violently against Hegel, calling him an intellectual Caliban to indicate the barbarity of his thought. He found it intolerable that Hegel would transform the pallid constitutive function of Kant's transcendental critique into a solid ontological figure with such violence. This was indeed the destiny of the transcendental in the European ideology of modernity. Hegel revealed what was implicit from the beginning of the counter-revolutionary development, that the liberation of modern humanity could only be a function of its domination, that the imminent goal of the multitude is transformed into the necessary and transcendent power of the state. It is true that Hegel restores a horizon of immanence and takes away the uncertainty of knowledge, the irresolution of action, and the fideist opening of Kantianism. The immanence Hegel restores, however, is really a blind immanence in which the potentiality of the multitude is denied and subsumed in the allegory of the divine order. The crisis of humanism is transformed into a dialectical dramaturgy, and in every scene, the end is everything and the means are merely ornamentation. There is no longer anything that strives, desires, or loves. The content of potentiality is blocked, controlled, hegemonized by finality. Paradoxically, the analogical being of the medieval Christian tradition is resurrected as a dialectical being. It is ironic that Schopenhauer would call Hegel a Caliban, the figure that was later held up as a symbol of the resistance to European domination and the affirmation of non-European desire. Hegel's drama of the other and the conflict between master and slave, however, could not but take place against the historical backdrop of European expansion and the enslavement of African, American, and Asian peoples. It is impossible, in other words, not to link both Hegel's philosophical recuperation of the other within the absolute spirit as his universal history leading from lesser peoples to its summit in Europe together with the very real violence of European conquest and colonialism. In short, Hegel's history is not only a powerful attack on the revolutionary plane of immanence, but also a negation of non-European desire. Finally, with another act of force, that intellectual Caliban inserted into the development of modernity the experience of a new conception of temporality, and he showed this temporality to be a dialectical teleology that is accomplished and arrives at its end. The entire genetic design of the concept found an adequate representation in the conclusion of the process. Modernity was complete, and there was no possibility of going beyond it. It was not by chance, then, that a further and definitive act of violence defined the scene. The dialectic of crisis was pacified under the domination of the state. Peace and justice reign once again. The state in and for itself is the ethical whole. It is essential to God's march through the world that the state exists. Modern sovereignty. The political solution offered by Hegel to the metaphysical drama of modernity demonstrates a profound and intimate relationship between modern European politics and metaphysics. Politics resides at the center of metaphysics because modern European metaphysics arose in response to the challenge of the liberated singularities and the revolutionary constitution of the multitude. It functioned as an essential weapon of the second mode of modernity insofar as it provided a transcendent apparatus that could impose order on the multitude and prevent it from organizing itself spontaneously and expressing its creativity autonomously. The second mode of modernity needed above all to guarantee its control over the new figures of social production both in Europe and the colonial spaces in order to rule and profit from the new forces that were transforming nature. In politics, as in metaphysics, the dominant theme was thus to eliminate the medieval form of transcendence, which only inhibits production and consumption, while maintaining transcendence's effect of domination in a form adequate to the modes of association and production of the new humanity. The center of the problem of modernity was thus demonstrated in political philosophy, and here was where the new form of mediation found its most adequate response to the revolutionary forms of immanence, a transcendent political apparatus. Thomas Hobbes' proposition of an ultimate and absolute sovereign ruler, a God on earth, plays a foundational role in the modern construction of a transcendent political apparatus. The first moment of Hobbes' logic is the assumption of civil war as the originary state of human society, a generalized conflict among individual actors. In a second moment, then, in order to guarantee survival against the mortal dangers of war, humans must agree to a pact that assigns to a leader the absolute right to act, or really, the absolute power to do all except take away the means of human survival and reproduction. Quote, seeing right reason is not existent. The reason of some man or men must supply the place thereof, and that man or men is he or they that have the sovereign power. End quote. The fundamental passage is accomplished by contract, a completely implicit contract prior to all social action or choice, that transfers every autonomous power of the multitude to a sovereign power that stands above and rules it. The transcendent political apparatus corresponds to the necessary and ineluctable transcendent conditions that modern philosophy posed at the pinnacle of its development, in Kantian schematism and Hegelian dialectics. According to Hobbes, the single wills of the various individuals converge and are represented in the will of the transcendent sovereign. Sovereignty is thus defined both by transcendence and by representation. Two concepts that the humanist tradition was posed as contradictory. On the one hand, the transcendence of the sovereign is founded not on external theological support, but only on the immanent logic of human relations. On the other hand, the representation that functions to legitimate the sovereign power also alienates it completely from the multitude of subjects. Like Jean Bodin before him, Hobbes recognized that the main point of sovereign majesty and absolute power consists of giving the law to subjects in general without their consent. But Hobbes manages to combine this notion with the contractual schema of representation that legitimates the sovereign power a priori. Here the concept of modern sovereignty is born in its state of transcendental purity. The contract of association is intrinsic to and inseparable from the contract of subjugation. This theory of sovereignty presents the first political solution to the crisis of modernity. In his own historical period, Hobbes' theory of sovereignty was functional to the development of monarchic absolutism, but in fact, its transcendental schema could be applied equally to various forms of government, monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, as the bourgeoisie rose to prominence it seemed there was really no alternative to the schema of power. It was not by chance, then, that Rousseau's democratic republicanism turned out to resemble the Hobbesian model. Rousseau's social contract guarantees that the agreement among individual wills is developed and sublimated in the construction of a general will, and that the general will proceeds from the alienation of the single wills toward the sovereignty of the state. As a model of sovereignty, Rousseau's Republican absolute is really no different from Hobbes's God on earth, the monarchic absolute. Quote, properly understood, all these clauses of the contract come down to a single one, namely the total alienation of each associate with all his rights to the whole community. End quote. The other conditions that Rousseau prescribes for the definition of sovereign power in the popular and democratic sense are completely irrelevant in the face of the absolutism of the Transcendent foundation. Specifically, Rousseau's notion of direct representation is distorted and ultimately overwhelmed by the representation of the totality that is necessarily linked to it, and this is perfectly compatible with the Hobbesian notion of representation. Hobbes and Rousseau really only repeat the paradox that Jean Bodin had already defined conceptually in the second half of the 16th century. Sovereignty can probably be said to exist only in monarchy, because only one can be sovereign. If two or three or many were to rule, there would be no sovereignty, because a sovereign cannot be subject to the rule of others. Democratic, plural, or popular political forms must be declared, but modern sovereignty really has only one political figure, a single transcendent power. There is at the base of modern theory of sovereignty, however, a further very important element, a content that fills and sustains a form of sovereign authority. This content is represented by capitalist development in the affirmation of the market as the foundation of the values of social reproduction. Without this content, which is always implicit, always working inside the transcendental apparatus, the form of sovereignty would not have been able to survive in modernity, and European modernity would not have been able to achieve a hegemonic position on a world scale. As Arif Derlich has noted, Eurocentrism distinguished itself from other ethnocentrisms, such as sinocentrism, and rose to global prominence principally because it was supported by the powers of capital. European modernity is inseparable from capitalism. This central relationship between the form and the content of modern sovereignty is fully articulated in the work of Adam Smith. Smith begins with a theory of industry that poses a contradiction between private enrichment and public interest. A first synthesis of these two levels is confided to the invisible hand of the market. The capitalist intends only his own gain, but he is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which is no part of his intention. The first synthesis, however, is precarious and fleeting. Political economy, considered a branch of the science of the administrator and legislator, must go further in conceiving the synthesis. It must understand the invisible hand of the market as a product of political economy itself, which is thus directed toward constructing the conditions of the autonomy of the market. All systems either of preference or restraint, therefore, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. In this case too, however, the synthesis is not at all guaranteed. In effect, a third passage is necessary. What is needed is for the state, which is minimal but effective, to make the well-being of private individuals coincide with the public interest, reducing all functions and laboring activities to one measure of value. That this state intervenes or not is secondary. What matters is that it give content to the mediation of interests and represent the axis of rationality of that mediation. The political transcendental of the modern state is defined as an economic transcendental. Smith's theory of value was the soul and substance of the concept of the modern sovereign state. In Hegel, the synthesis of the theory of modern sovereignty and the theory of value produced by capitalist political economy is finally realized. Just as in his work, there is a perfect realization of the consciousness of the union of the absolutist and Republican aspects, that is, the Hobbesian and Rousseauian aspects of the theory of modern sovereignty. Quote, in relation to the spheres of civil law and private welfare, the spheres of the family and civil society, the state is on the one hand an external necessity and the higher power to whose nature their laws and interests are subordinate and on which they depend. But, on the other hand, it is their immanent end, and its strength consists in the unity of its universal an ultimate end with the particular interests of individuals and the fact that they have duties towards the state to the same extent as they also have rights. End quote. The Hegelian relationship between particular and universal brings together in adequate and functional terms the Hobbes-Rousseau theory of sovereignty and Smith's theory of value. Modern European sovereignty is capitalist sovereignty, a form of command that overdetermines the relationship between individuality and universality as a function of the development of capital. The sovereignty machine. When the synthesis of sovereignty and capital is fully accomplished, and the transcendence of power is completely transformed into a transcendental exercise of authority, then sovereignty becomes a political machine that rules across the entire society. Through the workings of the sovereignty machine, the multitude is in every moment transformed into an ordered totality. We should pay close attention to this passage because here we can see clearly how the transcendental schema is an ideology that functions concretely and how different modern sovereignty is from that of the ancient regime. In addition to being a political power against all external political powers, a state against all other states, sovereignty is also a police power. It must continually and extensively accomplish the miracle of the subsumption of singularities in the totality, of the will of all into the general will. Modern bureaucracy is the essential organ of the transcendental, Hegel dixit, and even if Hegel exaggerates a bit in his quasi-theological consecration of the body of the state employees, at least he makes clear their central role in the effective functioning of the modern state. Bureaucracy operates the apparatus that combines legality and organizational efficiency, title in the exercise of power, politics, and police. The transcendental theory of modern sovereignty, thus reaching maturity, realizes a new individual by absorbing society into power. Little by little, as the administration develops, the relationship between society and power, between the multitude and the sovereign state, is inverted, so that now power and the state produce society. This passage in the history of ideas does indeed parallel the development of social history. It corresponds to the dislocation of the organizational dynamic of the state from the terrain of medieval hierarchy to that of modern discipline, from command to function. Max Weber and Michel Foucault, to mention only the most illustrious, have insisted at length on this metamorphosis in the sociological figures of power. In the long transformation from medieval to modern society, the first form of the political regime was, as we have seen, rooted in transcendence. Medieval society was organized according to a hierarchical schema of degrees of power. This is what modernity blew apart in the course of its development. Foucault refers to this transition as a passage from the paradigm of sovereignty to that of governmentality, whereby sovereignty means the transcendence of the single point of command above the social field, and by governmentality he means the general economy of discipline that runs throughout society. We prefer to conceive of this as a passage within the notion of sovereignty, as a transition to a new form of transcendence. Modernity replaced the traditional transcendence of command with the transcendence of the ordering function. Arrangements of discipline have begun to be formed already in the classical age, but only in modernity did the disciplinary diagram become the diagram of administration itself. Throughout this passage, administration exerts a continuous, extensive, and tireless effort to make the state always more intimate to social reality, and thus produce and order social labor. The old theses, a la Tocqueville, of the continuity of administrative bodies across different social eras are thus profoundly revised, when not completely discarded. Foucault, however, goes still further to claim the disciplinary processes which are put into practice by the administration delve so deeply into society that they manage to configure themselves as apparatuses that take into account the collective biological dimension of the reproduction of the population. The realization modern sovereignty is the birth of biopower. Before Foucault, Max Weber also described the administrative mechanisms involved in the formation of modern sovereignty. Whereas Foucault's analysis is vast in its diachronotic breadth, Weber's is powerful in its synchronic depth. With respect to our discussion of modern sovereignty, Weber's contribution is first of all his claim that the opening of modernity is defined as a scission, a creative condition of individuals and the multitude against a process of state reappropriation. State sovereignty is thus defined as a regulation of this relationship of force. Modernity is above all marked by the tension of the opposing forces. Every process of legitimation is regulated by this tension and operates to block its capacity for rupture and recuperate its creative initiative. The closure of the crisis of modernity and a new sovereign power can be given in old and quasi-naturalist forms, as is the case with traditional legitimation, or rather it can be given in sacred and innovative, irrationally innovative forms, as in charismatic legitimation, or finally, and this is to a large extent the most effective form of late modernity, it can be given in the form of administrative rationalization. The analysis of these forms of legitimation is Weber's second relevant contribution, which builds on the first, the recognition of the dualism of the paradigm. The third relevant point is Weber's treatment of the procedural character of the transformation, the always present and possible interweaving of the various forms of legitimation in their continuous capacity to be extended and deepened in the control of social reality. From this follows a final paradox. If on the one hand this process closes the crisis of modernity, on the other hand it reopens it. The form of the process of closure is as critical and conflictual as the genesis of modernity. In this respect, Weber's work has a great merit to have completely destroyed the self-satisfied and triumphant conception of the sovereignty of the modern state that Hegel had produced. Weber's analysis was quickly taken up by the writers engaged in the critique of modernity, from Heidegger to Lukács to Horkheimer to Adorno. They all recognized that Weber had revealed the illusion of modernity. The illusion of the antagonistic dualism that resides at the base of modernity could be subsumed in a unitary synthesis investing all of society and politics, including the productive forces and the relations of production. They recognized finally that modern sovereignty had passed its peak and begun to wane. As modernity declines, a new season is opened, and here we find again that dramatic antithesis that was the origins and basis of modernity. Has anything really changed? The Civil War has erupted again in full force. The synthesis between the development of productive forces and relations of domination seems once again precarious and improbable. The desires of the multitude and its antagonism to every form of domination drive it to divest itself once again of the processes of legitimation that support the sovereign power. Certainly, no one would imagine this as a return of that old world of desires that animated the first humanist revolution. New subjectivities inhabit the new terrain. Modernity and its capitalist relations have completely changed the scene in the course of its development. And yet something remains. There is a sense of déjà vu when we see the reappearance of the struggles that have continuously been passed down from those origins. The experience of the revolution will be reborn after modernity, but within the new conditions that modernity constructed in such a contradictory way. Machiavelli's return to origins seems to be combined with Nietzsche's heroic eternal return. Everything is different, and nothing seems to have changed. Is this the coming of a new human power? For this is the secret of the soul. When the hero hath abandoned it, then only reapproacheth it in dreams. The superhero. Humanism after the death of man. Michel Foucault's final works in the history of sexuality bring to life once again that same revolutionary impulse that animated Renaissance humanism. The ethical care of the self reemerges as a constituent power of self-creation. How is it possible that the author who worked so hard to convince us of the death of man, the thinker who carried the banner of anti-humanism throughout his career, would in the end champion these central tenets of the humanist tradition? We do not mean to suggest that Foucault contradicts himself or that he reversed his earlier position. He was always so insistent about the continuity of his discourse. Rather, Foucault asks in his final work a paradoxical and urgent question. What is humanism after the death of man? Or rather, what is anti-humanist or post-human humanism? This question, however, is only a seeming paradox that derives at least in part from a terminological confusion between two distinct notions of humanism. The anti-humanism that was such an important project for Foucault and Althusser in the 1960s can be linked effectively to a battle that Spinoza fought 300 years earlier. Spinoza denounced any understanding of humanity as in imperium in imperio. In other words, he refused to accord any laws to human nature that were different than the laws of nature as a whole. Donna Haraway carries on Spinoza's project in our day as she insists on breaking down the barriers we pose among the human, the animal, and the machine. If we are to conceive man as separate from nature, then man does not exist. This recognition is precisely the death of man. This anti-humanism, however, need not conflict with the revolutionary spirit of Renaissance humanism we outlined earlier from Cusano to Marsilius. In fact, this anti-humanism follows directly on Renaissance humanism's secularizing project, or more precisely, its discovery of the plane of immanence. Both projects are founded on an attack on transcendence. There is a strict continuity between the religious thought that accords a power above nature to God and the modern secular thought that accords that same power above nature to man. The transcendence of God is simply transferred to man. Like God before it, this man that stands separate from and above nature has no place in a philosophy of immanence. Like God, too, this transcendent figure of man leads quickly to the imposition of social hierarchy and domination. Anti-humanism, then, conceived as a refusal of any transcendence, should in no way be confused with the negation of the vis viva, the creative life force that animates the revolutionary stream of the modern tradition. On the contrary, the refusal of transcendence is a condition of possibility of thinking this immanent power, an anarchic basis of philosophy. Ni Dieu, ni maître, ni l'homme. The humanism of Foucault's final works, then, should not be seen as contradictory to, or even as a departure from, the death of man he proclaimed 20 years earlier. Once we recognize our post-human bodies and minds, once we see ourselves for the simians and cyborgs we are, we then need to explore the vis viva, the creative powers that animate us as they do all of nature and actualize our potentialities. This is humanism after the death of man, what Foucault calls le travail de soi sur soi, the continuous constituent project to create and recreate ourselves and our world.